Do you ever get tired of hearing people like Brian Hales say, "Where did all the words come from for Joseph Smith to write the Book of Mormon? How did he get all these ideas?" Well, finally, I think there is a book that has just come out that answers that question, and it answers it in spades. It is a book titled Joseph Smith, the Architect of Mormonism, a topical biography by my friend Ganesh Cherian. And this book, I believe, not only explains the Book of Mormon, but Mormonism itself. Stay tuned tonight on Mormonism Live. And now we'll go right into our subject matter. Can we bring Ganesh onto the stage? Ganesh, how are you doing?
Fabulous. And it's just a treat to be with you guys. It's always lots of fun, your program, and this particular one, because it's live. It has a dynamic about it that is real and invigorating, and that's
Terrifying.
what people love. Terrifying. That's
yes,
true.
Absolutely. Hey, guess what? This thing's about 600 pages long. This is a huge, massive book. Now, I know there's a lot of quoting that you do in it of sources. And you had mentioned that to me before you sent me the book. You were kind enough to send me the book for me to read. By the way, I have not read every word in it, but I've read many of the words in it. Fantastic. I think this is epic. I think you have taken pieces that have been researched over time and decades, and with an unusually adept mastery of the sources, put them all together in, I think, a fascinating novel and perhaps watershed kind of format to explain not only why it is that the Book of Mormon is the way it is, but why it is that Mormonism changed so much between the Book of Mormon in 1829, the 15 years until Joseph Smith died in 1844. And then you go over a host of different areas, different subjects of this, different subjects within each of those subjects, right? And then, fascinatingly enough, you not only show and document where it starts, but where it ends up. And in each case, you propose what you call a pivot point between 1829 and 1844 that may account in whole or in part for the change. How did you come up with this idea?
Oh, well, actually, I must credit William Davis and Dan McClellan. And it was years ago, one of William Davis's was his Sunstone presentation that particular year, because of COVID, was online, and so I got to see it because I'm in New Zealand, of course, and going to those things is tricky. And he presented the Book of Mormon as a play, as a performance, and that was a revolutionary idea to me. And once I saw it, of course, I could not unsee it. And he masterfully talked about that. And of course, that was part of his book, Visions in the Seer Stone. And it just intrigued me. And then around that same time, just a little bit after, Dan McClellan was getting big on TikTok, and he was making a big splash in the biblical criticism area. And he didn't say a lot about Mormonism or the Book of Mormon, but when he did, he reframed it in that 19th century context, and basically said at the time, and he said more since, that if you're going to understand the Book of Mormon, you need to look at it through a 19th century lens. And so at the time, I looked at those kind of two ideas, and they resounded with me, and I thought about a number of things that I had noticed in the Book of Mormon, and also how the church had progressed to Nauvoo, that gave me pause for how things might have come about, and I identified a number of things, a couple of prejudices I thought were related to Joseph that he flipped on by the time he got to Nauvoo, that were really prevalent in the Book of Mormon. And so I thought there was 2 or 3 things that were worth, kind of writing down and talking about. And so I was just going to do an article because I quite like that. And I had done a few before. And then when I started to do that, I started to realize that there were a few more things that I recognized from the Book of Mormon that Joseph had changed his, feeling or belief on by 1844. And of course, you've gone over a number of those in the past, and so those resounded. And then I thought, gosh, I wonder if you can do it the other way around, if you can take something that the church now does, and can you see that it was different prior? And of course, then I found a whole lot more. And then start talking to other people, and they talk about some of the things that they've noticed, and they're different things that I've noticed. And suddenly there starts to be a very, very long list. And it seems to follow the same trajectory. And that is, the Book of Mormon seems to be very much Joseph at 23 years old, with his ideology and his idealism of that particular time in his life, like we all are when we're in our early 20s, thinking we can solve the world's problems. And if only people listen to us, we'd have it all right. And then, of course, Nauvoo, he's 38 years old. He's the leader of a big movement that is got trickinesses and troubles, and how he manages what. So Nauvoo is him at 38, and his responsibilities as a church leader, as the basis for this movement. So those were big revelations. And if I use those two big data points, and then I could extrapolate, his own personal experience prior to the Book of Mormon, his family circumstance, and his, broader culture, those all seem to align very heavily with what came into the Book of Mormon. And of course, what happened after Nauvoo, with Brigham Young going to Utah and taking the saints and expounding on some of those things and extending them from Nauvoo. And then the bit in the middle, which was, the beginning of the church in New York and Kirtland, through to Nauvoo, there was often the beginnings, the early church was very similar to the Book of Mormon. The later church was very similar to Nauvoo, and somewhere in between there was some pressure point, some pivot, where Joseph had to respond to his idealism with practical reality, which changed the course of the game. And so those became data points that then just got more and more fleshed out as, of course, you read
I know,
more and more.
I know you have a slideshow ready, and I don't mean to rush beyond where you're ready to go, but I'm looking forward, and I think the audience would too, to help us understand what it is we're saying, or what you're saying, and I'm asking about, to see a couple of examples of this kind of thing that you're talking about, because I didn't count all the examples. There's a whole bunch of chapters and a whole bunch of examples within each chapter, and some more than others. Is there around 100 examples?
So there's 45 chapters, and there are, there's in the book, there's actually, if you go to the slides, I may be able to talk to them as we go, because I think that the first one might be the.
Suffice it to say, there's a lot of examples you give.
Yeah, and there's a lot of examples, and then there's a lot of data points. So this slide is just, really just the blurb of the book, and really it's just about examining that tension between the Book of Mormon and Nauvoo, and how that plays out, and why it plays out the way it does, is the basis of the book. I mean, the book was never meant to be a biography. It wasn't even a book. It was just an article. But then I realized along the way, of course, that you couldn't understand the tension between the Book of Mormon and Nauvoo without understanding what was happening to Joseph in the moment, in real time. So, yeah.
I think you do something really cool here. And when we've gone into Mormonism, all across all the variations of topics that one needs to go into to really understand this religion, there are ideas or topics that go across time. And so if you work with a story, working with chronology, what you end up with is you don't really get to deliver to the audience the context of an issue. And what I think you did that is really helpful is to break this up into topics or ideas or certain mindsets or things going on in Joseph Smith's head or in the milieu that would lead to this development of an idea or a doctrine or a principle or a behavior in Joseph Smith's life, and then name the thing and then go out and find the evidence that supports what that development looked like and why it happened the way it did. And I think it presents the information to the audience in a way that's more easily digestible if you really want to understand the nature of a human being. And so I just want to say kudos for doing it that way. And I'm excited to see the information that you've got tonight.
Bill, that was an incredible summation of everything. That's exactly what I hoped for, and I'm glad that you got that from reading it. So that's perfect. So yeah, I mean, look, it's a big work. It ended up to be over 600 pages, and look, it's a little fat in the sense that I did 1,500 LDS scripture references, and some of them I quoted in their entirety, mainly because I was looking at the Book of Mormon in its context so novelly. I didn't want people to just have a reference. I wanted them to have the actual scriptural verse so they could see it and read it and understand that it was there, rather than having to go back and forth to the scriptures. So really the book should only be 300 pages, but it's 600 pages for that reason. But I thought it was really important to be able to qualify everything and see it next to each other so that you could make that determination. 45 chapters in 5 sections. So talking about different cultural aspects of Joseph's life, the settler worldview that underpinned American expansion across the continental United States, Native Americans and their role in that, because of course they're the indigenous people, and this is displacing them. The theologies that were present in Joseph's life and how that developed through the Book of Mormon into the early church, and pivoted by Nauvoo. Individual prejudices that I think were really key to Joseph, and these are the first things I saw. So those are actually probably the most complete chapters in the book. And then Joseph's magic worldview, the folk magic that underpins his particular family and his environment from New England through to New York, because that's really specific to that really tight area in Western New York that he was living, and in particular to his family. And so, look, there's 1,350 historical references, mostly from the Joseph Smith Papers Project, because, gosh, I couldn't have done this work any time else in history, because I live in New Zealand and I can do it on my laptop in my lounge. And that means that every single person in the world can do this too. So I've put in all those references so you can qualify what I've talked about, and you can go there and make sure that what I've said is accurate and maybe in context. And then those 1,500 LDS scripture references, which I think are, give weight to what is actually happening in the moment. And that means that there's about an average of 60 data points per chapter. And so that's a lot of, little individual points that you can go, okay, this is there, this is there, this is there, and it all lines up. So hopefully that gives a good way of testing that this is accurate. And there are probably many more data points I've missed, because it's just so huge. And I invite the reader to email me with their suggestions or their additions or even their contradictions if they don't agree. And most importantly, I think it's that every single chapter in the Book of Mormon is represented. So so every page of the Book of Mormon is, if you could call it, explained, or at least put in its context of its environment and Joseph's thinking about it and where it fits in the timeline of his understanding. So what I thought we might cover today is just 5 big things that I think is worthy, that are fun and interesting, and just firstly just talking about how little we know about Joseph as members of the church, and why that is the case, and then and how everything is dependent. My book suggests that this is Joseph. Like, we can't get away from it. He is the data point. Everybody else revolves around him, and he may well involve lots of other people, but you can singularly distill everything in Mormonism down to Joseph, which I think is a really important point. The folk magic, how much of a contributor that is to our Mormonism, when actually we don't even think about that today, but it's just the water that Mormonism swims in.
Like when President Nelson tells us we have to obey with exactness.
Exactly, right? That's the magic worldview. If you don't do it exact, you won't get the result. And that explains why the result doesn't happen, because somebody made a mistake or didn't follow through the procedure or didn't make it as it was supposed to be. And the explanation for why it goes wrong. And then what Joseph's death tells us about him, because actually, there's so much. So his death is really interesting in the trajectory of his life. Why did it happen? And, why was it so dramatic? And then, of course, let's just talk about the Book of Mormon, because I think that's always a big deal for people. How do we know it's Joseph, and what's happening to Joseph at the time that he's creating the Book of Mormon? So, that's what we're going to talk about today.
Great. So the first one is general members know so little about Joseph. Why is that, by the way? I've got a feeling as I read your book, I thought the leaders of the church, they keep the members in the dark about Joseph, because the more they know about Joseph and the times he lived in, the easier it is to see that he's the one who wrote the Book of Mormon. Yeah,
that's pretty much it. The more you know about what's happening at the time, you just see that this is in the milieu, this is in the culture, this is in his neighborhood, this is in his family, this is in his own personal life, right? Like the ideas of the Book of Mormon particularly are the ideas of a young man grappling with the tough things that are happening in his own world. And it's so beautiful, it's amazing, really, but it's not so mysterious. And
as I read your book, the thought came to me that there is no book that I know of that so plainly and obviously declares it's the time and place of its production than the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. And as a member, of course, when you're looking at it, it feels, you don't, because you don't know the context, and it's 200 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. You just don't even see that. You just feel like must be something special. You don't realize that actually it's responding to its environment. It is the words of somebody trying to explain what is happening in his world, what's happening in his family, what's happening, to his neighbor, what's happening to him. Like there are just so many great impacts that the Book of Mormon is showing you what's happening around him.
You guys are hitting on something. The apologist, Stephen Harper, is one of them that said this, but the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Mm-hmm. And it's used as a way to say, yes, Joseph got together with 14-year-old children, but, if you understood that day, and the reality is, if we understood that day, which you go to lengths to help us understand some of that, it does help us make sense of Joseph Smith. Maybe not the way Stephen Harper would like us to, but it does help us make sense of Joseph Smith, because understanding the world, when D. Michael Quinn came out with the Magic Worldview, when that book came out, it helped all of us go like, oh, this kind of stuff is the waters that Joseph Smith is swimming in. And you do that again here, but not just with the magic topic, but with other things as well. And the past is a foreign country, and they do things differently there. We can make sense of that world if we understand that foreign country.
Yeah, the problem is that this is a foreign country from 200 years ago, and we are led to believe it's a foreign country from 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. Well, that's what Jan Ship said. She suggested that, and it's a great quote that Dan Vogel used in the beginning of his book, Charisma Under Pressure. The mystery of Mormonism cannot be solved until we solve the mystery of Joseph Smith. And that means looking at Joseph Smith's life, looking at his environment, looking at his family, and then we see that he's trying to answer the tough stuff that's happening in his world.
What are some of the things that are happening here? Church narrative, historical narrative. What are some of the ideas here that you're wanting to convey to the reader?
So the reason why we know so little about Joseph is because the church narrative is to suggest that it's miraculous and it's spiritual, which is great. That's a fabulous narrative. It suggests that Joseph and his family are seekers. The first vision comes as a part of that seeking. The angel Moroni is there to deliver the gold plates in the Book of Mormon, and the church establishment and revelation and the persecution and the martyrdom of Joseph are very much in line with the spiritual nature and connection with God. That's the trajectory. That's the timeline. That's the chronology that the church narrative is. But if you put it in its historical narrative, you see something quite different, and it kind of explains. Well, for me, it's a much more explanatory mechanism, and that is, Joseph is in great poverty. Treasure seeking is a way to try and alleviate that. It turns into a creation of a literary work like the Book of Mormon. This creates a gathering. People gather on the basis of his ideas, and this morphs into entitlement. They feel special because God has, they're buying into this narrative that that this is a special time with a special set of scripture that is now giving them the mechanism to know that they're special, and they're entitled to the blessings of God, the inheritance. And of course, then they encroach onto land that other people have. This turns into conflict. There's often some kind of retrenchment, and then there's some form of attack, and that's what leads to Joseph's death ultimately. But it's also a cycle of entitlement, encroachment, conflict, and retrenchment and attack that the church goes on to continue to do. And they did that in Jackson County, Missouri. They do it in Caldwell County, Missouri. They do it in Nauvoo. They do it, Brigham Young, and then does it in Utah. So this is a ongoing thing, because if you're special, then you are entitled to take from somebody else, and when there's conflict, you're entitled to fight back. And so the violence becomes a big part of that early part of the church, and it shapes the church in some pretty significant ways.
Yeah. So your next slide, and by the way, any point in this when you would like us to turn a slide, just say so. I don't know that you have the controls to do it, but RFM and I both should have access to change the slides here up on the screen. So just say so, and we'll do that. What's the connection here you're making with these images?
So I'm just suggesting that the Book of Mormon is Joseph at 23, and Nauvoo, Illinois is Joseph at 38 years old, right? So at 23, Joseph's a poor treasure digger who looks in a hat with a stone, right? But in 1844, Joseph is a general with an army and a city at his disposal. These are two different people, and the theology, the where he's at, his dress, even, his this is a good example. His title, he's just Joseph Smith, that farmer kid from down the road, right? But in Nauvoo, who's General, Lieutenant General Joseph Smith, and people call him by his general name. When he's 23, he's wearing farm smock, right? When he's 38, he's wearing a military uniform, and that's his favorite clothes. We don't understand. Well, I feel like we often don't think of Joseph as, who is he? He's 23 years old. He's newly married, trying to have a baby. At 38, he's got multiple spouses, multiple children, lots of people in his care. He's in charge of a whole city. So these are two different people, and these the documents that are created at these two different times reflect the motivations, the concerns, the hopes, and the ideals of those particular places. And it's once you start to see those things, you start to get an idea of who Joseph is and why things might have changed and how he might be feeling about them, and why that's how that's motivating the actions that he's taking.
Yeah, there's so much of a change in so many areas in this 15 years between 1829 and 1844, and even before 1844 in a lot of cases. I mean, there's so many things where the Book of Mormon, or I'm going to say Joseph Smith at 23, writes a book or dictates a book that is absolutely cover to cover anti-Masonic in sentiment. There's nothing about it that's pro-Masonic. It's all, anytime the subject comes, it's anti-Masonry. And yet, before 15 years is out, Joseph Smith has not only adopted Masonry for his church, but he's adopted the central, I believe it's the central play, performance, ordinance. I don't know what they call it in Masonry. He's adopted a lot of that for use in his temple endowment. So he goes there. That's complete turnaround in 15 years. You've got the Book of Mormon, or Joseph Smith at 23, as you say, being very, very against kings. It's very against kings. But by the time Joseph Smith's dead, he's been crowned king of Israel. So these are amazing. He changed a lot in those 15 years. Now, we would hope that we would all change as we grow. And Joseph Smith did too. And so we end up in the church with this interesting situation where we generally teach, well, what do we teach? I think this is one of the reasons it's so hard to define doctrine in the LDS church. Because at one and the same time, we're supposed to maintain these opposite ideas in our head about what doctrine is. What it says in the Book of Mormon about salvation for the dead versus what Joseph Smith came up with in 1841, and what we do in our temples with the baptisms for the dead. How are we supposed to keep those together? So anyway, these are some of the reasons I find it so interesting. Let's go ahead. Let's get into some examples here.
All right, let's go. What's our next slide?
Can I say something really quick here, which is when I was presented with church history from the church's correlated curriculum, we all get certain images of Joseph Smith. They're very selective about which ones. You can see some of those pictures right here. We get a snapshot of Joseph Smith at a certain point in his life. They all seem to portray Joseph Smith kind of in his maybe early 30s is kind of the look we get. And you don't really get the context of like, here, he's 13 years old when he gets his first seer stone. He's 14 years old when he has the first vision. We do talk about that. But how old he is when the Book of Mormon's published, how old he is when these things, and just like all of us, we're all complex human beings who, I'm not the same person I was when I was 13 or 17 or 23. And it helps out a bunch to sort of see Joseph Smith in these moments in time that as a shifting, changing, developing human being who is constantly adapting to the world around him. And so I think to what you guys said early on, it's really helpful to get this big picture.
And it's very human, right? This makes him real, not just a caricature, right? He's not this thing. He's a person who has experiences, feelings, thoughts, motivations, he's maybe doing some not great things, but he's also doing some lovely things, like it's not one way or the other, it's a whole person. I just put these list of biographies together because, look, the reality is very few members of the church have ever read a biography of Joseph. Just haven't. Because
Isn't that weird?
The problem is, it's really weird.
We all belong to a church that has a founder that we treat as special, and so few members really know very much about him at all.
And yet they get up on and I've done it too. So I got up on the pulpit and said, it unequivocally, this is the person that I admire the most, and I'm grateful for him for what has transpired in my life. And yet, I wouldn't have known what his sisters' names were, or maybe I could have named two of his brothers, or absolutely, it's mind-boggling that we ascribe so much to him, and yet people know so little about him. Really, we parrot the same things as if they're, revelations and amazing, when actually we have no, very little detail.
All right. Anything you want to say about those biographies? Otherwise, we can.
No, just that they are there. So read them. I mean, I've got one that's a topical biography, which is, has a particular place. But John Turner's just put out a new biography of Joseph Smith, and it looks fabulous. I haven't read it yet, but all of the interviews I've seen of him have been amazing. And he, from an outside perspective, gives an incredibly lovely, thoughtful expose about Joseph that I think is worthy of considering.
Very good.
So one of the points I wanted to make with the book, and what I kind of discovered, I guess, is that everything is dependent on him, right? Like and I've put it into 5 sections. There's a kind of a 6 kind of section, and one is that there's this settler worldview. He's in a environment of American exceptionalism. It still exists today, 200 years later. But the idea that America is special. America is special. And we're talking about the United States. We're not talking about the Americas. We're not talking about Canada. We're not talking about Mexico. We're not talking about Central or South America. This is the United States. And there's a lot of refugee narrative in the Book of Mormon, because Joseph was a refugee. He was an economic refugee. He fled New England. His family fled New England to Western New York because they were just in poverty and desperate. And Joseph fled many times during his life, especially, he fled Palmyra for Harmony, Pennsylvania in the end of 1827 with Emma, because things were getting rough. The refugee narrative explains Joseph a lot, but also it explains America. There were tons of people who fled Britain and Europe because their particular ideas were not wanted, or their economic situation was terrible. They were all hoping for something, and that's just Joseph experienced that personally, but it was also part of the makeup of America, that this was a refugee nation taking the cream from the continental Europe to do something special with. And underpinning some of that was patriarchy and white supremacy, and of course that dovetailed into how this worked with the indigenous inhabitants. The Native Americans, there was genocide, there was displacement, there was disarmament, there was land conquest, there was language lost. This is part of what was happening in early America, but that was also what Joseph was trying to explain. The Book of Mormon, in many ways, is a kind of a leopard, how the leopard got its spots, how the Native Americans became so savage, right? And that underpins the Book of Mormon, absolutely, but it also underpins the church in the way that it responds to other people's stories, and particularly indigenous inhabitants around the world, around Central and South America, and even in my part of the world in the Pacific, right? So in the Pacific Islands and in New Zealand with the Māori. So these are things that are really important to me because I see them every single day.
Yeah, I think that the Book of Mormon also underscores the prevalent idea in Joseph Smith's day that the Native Americans needed to be preached to and Christianized.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the title page, right? That's the premise for the Book of Mormon, that the Book of Mormon would convert the natives and have them restored to their blessings of Israel. And of course, when that didn't happen, then there was a pivot, like we talked about before. And the pivot was, I will go preach to, poor Europeans in Britain particularly, and they joined in droves and actually came to America and made the situation worse for the Native Americans.
Yeah, interestingly, as you point out in your book, Joseph Smith's answer to the fact that they got thrown out of what is it called, Indian territory. In other words, the Indian agents would not allow the Mormon missionaries to preach to the Native Americans as God had called them to, because they were worried that they might be up to no good. And so Joseph Smith's response appears to have been, oh, well, forget about it. We're not going to go to the Native Americans anymore. It's just sort of something that the Book of Mormon is entirely built around, but then Joseph Smith throws it off like it was, just a bad idea.
And those pivots happen all the time because
you are saying pivots, right? Ganesh, you are saying pivots, right?
Yep, I'm saying pivots.
Okay. Just with your accent, it sounds a little bit like perverts to me, and I wanted to make sure.
Well, that's part of the story too, RFM. So who knows?
You're saying there's a pervert point, and I didn't know if you meant Joseph.
Pervert point.
He had some of those too.
Oh, gosh.
Or Jacob Hansen.
Yes. My accent, yeah. Look, good clarification, because we're not doing subtitles on this, but maybe we should, so that people can understand what I'm saying. Then theology. Okay, look, well, theology is a big section in the book, huge actually. It's the biggest section, and it just goes through all of those points. And look, Radio Free Mormons had a lot of work on this basis, those. And I've utilized lots of people's work in looking at this. Godhead, salvation, redemption for the dead, hell, word of wisdom, everything. Speaking in tongues, that was a big part of the early church. Obviously not something we do now. Those kinds of really interesting reasons why some things were big in the Book of Mormon and are absent or completely contradicted now. It's really fun to look at those, especially because we're so attached to some of these theologies, particularly in the church, because we're told that we know the right way to do things, and this is the right doctrine. So to even see that it changed in Joseph Smith's life, let alone later on, maybe till now, those are, to me, really fascinating. But I think very validating too for lots of people who go, gosh, I just don't understand why this is here, and why we're in a different place.
The Book of Mormon in Moroni 7, if you want me to just condense it down, it says on this subject, if you don't have the gift of tongues, you're damned. That's what Moroni 7 says. That's what the Book of Mormon says.
Yeah. And now it's a non-event, and we just don't talk about it, don't do it, and there's so many like that. There's a redefinition.
There's sort of this general idea that missionaries can learn their foreign languages faster than non-missionaries.
Yeah, and that pivot happened back in 1835, 36, right? And there's a really good reason there was that pivot, because if you can speak in tongues, that's everybody can do it. In fact, too many people could do it. The poor could do it. The women could do it. People of color could do it, and it could give them prominence. And of course, that was a threat to the hierarchy that started to develop. And so the hierarchy stamped that out, because if you spoke in tongues, that might mean that you had some prominence, some specialty, some primacy. And so my favorite one in there is the redemption of the dead, because actually the Book of Mormon speaks against redemption for the dead, because it says that there are some people who are just going to be saved in their ignorance, because that's just the way that the atonement works. And we know that Alvin is seen in the celestial kingdom. He didn't have to be baptized to be in the celestial kingdom,
because he would have accepted it with all of his heart if he'd had the chance. Yeah. That's the second step.
That's the second step. And then in Nauvoo, we're baptizing everybody all over the place, and then we're forcing them to do it in a temple, because by this point these people don't want to do another temple. They just lost Kirtland, and they don't. What was the whole temple thing for? And Joseph's like, well, I like a temple, and actually the Lord tells me now you have to do this particular work in the temple or it's not accepted. And so those are the really interesting flips that just make it Mormonism so much fun, but also maddening at the same time.
Down there
Yeah.
at the bottom where it says Joseph's ideologies, and you have the first one of God lies. I know what you're talking about, but I'll bet the audience would like to hear more.
Yeah. So yes, so gosh, one of the big things that happen, and of course you look at Doctrine and Covenants section 19, and we've talked about this before, that Joseph is now trying to get Martin to fund the Book of Mormon production and publication like he said he would. But Martin is threatened by the ideas in the Book of Mormon because Joseph has undergone a transformation from the time that Martin was a scribe to now Oliver is the scribe. We're hearing these things about damnation in the Book of Mormon, and these are things that are totally against Martin's universalist understandings. And so Doctrine and Covenants section 19 is Joseph utilizing God's revelation to tell Martin that when the Book of Mormon is talking about eternal damnation, it's God's, because eternal is the name of God, it's God's damnation, and it doesn't actually mean eternal, it just means God. And so one of the explanations for this trick of God is that he is just doing this because if people think that the damnation or the torment is going to end, that they won't act very well. So God lies so that people will repent and act properly. So this is a big justification that becomes huge through the church and for Joseph too, because if it means that as long as he's accomplishing a good thing, he can lie with impunity, and that becomes the basis for much of what Joseph does, but also how the church continues through to today. Because if the church is bringing you to Christ, it doesn't matter the means by which it does it, because bringing people to Christ is the ultimate. So if you just have to fudge the truth in order to get them to do it, or that's acceptable. In fact, if people get baptized, your sins are going to be forgiven. So even those sins of misrepresentation or fudging the truth or pushing you to the end, that's all fine.
Well, very good. Thank you for explaining that for us. I think that's fascinating. And I think that Mormonism, that's the one thing that's really vibrant and alive in Mormonism today, is lying for the Lord.
Yeah. And you can, and it's not even just that you're lying, right? It's that you're lying with good intent. It's pernicious because it makes you feel good to lie, that's a virtue. That's a virtue.
And you can see that's carried through to the modern moment. I mean, the top 15 of this religion still use those sort of mechanisms and still justify it in the exact same way.
Yeah. Yeah. And to be fair, that's human, right? Because, if your wife says, do I look good in this? You go, yes, you do. You're fabulous. Maybe change this a little bit, but yeah. We cater our message to be as positive as possible for the people that we love, even when it might be kinder and more accurate and perhaps even better in the long term if we, address the ugly truths.
Very good. What's this chronology?
So this goes back to what we were talking about that you wanted to talk about before Radio Free Mormon, was that what are the pivot points? So this is just 7 solid pivot points that I think really that I've tried to employ through all of the 45 different topics. And so that and then around those there are more data points. So you might like I said, there's an average of 60 data points per chapter. So some of these points have several and there's bits in between. But so if we're looking at the chronology about these particular topics, I'm looking at the early 19th century American context. So for instance, the New Republic, the War of 1812, the Second Great Awakening, Erie Canal. These are major events and circumstances in early America that are underpinning Joseph's understanding of the world. Then there's Joseph's immediate family. So what's happening to them? This is his parents, his grandparents, his siblings, the family dynamic, what is going on? So, there's some of these are, Joseph's grandfathers were patriots, his mother, his father to some degree, religious seekers, his dad's a treasure digger. There's death, Joseph's parents have lost children in infancy, and they lose Alvin at 23 years old. And even Joseph, loses a child in infancy. So this is, these are, death is a major portion, and poverty is massive. I think we don't understand how desperate the Smiths were. They were on their last chance. Like this, the Book of Mormon is a Hail Mary, like it's literally the last option, because Joseph needs to save his family from ruin. His parents are going to die. They're getting older. They've got no means of support. There are still younger children at home. This is starvation. But they had come from wealth. They both, Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith Sr. had come from wealthy families. They were now the poor, disgraced cousins who had too many children and not enough means and a lot of drinking, and they were looked down upon by their cousins, and they were looked down upon by their neighbors. It was dire. I can't stress enough how bad it was for the Smith family. And Joseph, his personal circumstances, he feels really responsible. Alvin had with Joseph Smith Sr.'s inability to provide, Alvin had stepped up and was leading the family, and his untimely death just decimated them economically and emotionally. And Hiram was not the leader that Alvin was. Hiram's like a benign, he's a pleasant guy, but he's just, he's a good kid, and but he's just not a leader. And so Joseph has to step up, and he feels really responsible for his parents. He's responsible to Alvin, who on his deathbed said to Joseph, make sure our parents are taken care of in their old age. Joseph has eloped. He's almost run away from home at this particular point, and eloped and married Emma, trying to change his circumstance, but that pull back to his family was really, really important. He needed change, he needed income, he needed prominence, he needed to restore his family's honor and amongst his extended family, but also in his community. These are the motivations of Joseph. These are the particular events related to him and Emma that underpin all of what's going on, and what then ends up in the Book of Mormon. So,
it is interesting how some of these things show up. I mean, when Alvin dies, there's this revelatory experience Joseph claims where he sees Alvin is in heaven, in the celestial kingdom, whatever it is, and it doesn't really follow LDS theology. There are issues with that whole experience with Alvin. He hasn't had the work done for him yet. He's supposed to be in spirit prison, but yet here he is. He's seen in essentially as having made it back to the Father. And then you see when Joseph Smith loses, I think it's his first child, right at the moment he's translating the Book of Mormon, that experience makes its way in to child baptism and, that whole issue being sorted out in the Book of Mormon. And we know, again, Dan Vogel has accounted for this in the conversations when we've covered this topic, but it's at the moment that happens that Joseph Smith is translating that section of the Book of Mormon. And so as you're pointing out, it's fascinating to see Joseph Smith's life unfold. And if you're given the context, if you can see the topic, see the chronology, see what's happening in Joseph Smith's life, make a correlation to what's going on around him in his theological explorations, you can see that one is directly connected to the other.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. You can see a young man struggling with some of these really tough questions, right? How do I provide for my family? How do I provide for my parents who need a leader? How do I provide for my younger siblings who are nearing starvation? It's just desperate. So yeah, I have a lot of grace for the 23-year-old Joseph. Not so much grace for the 38-year-old Joseph, right? But the 23-year-old Joseph, gosh, my heart aches for him.
What happened to the 23-year-old Joseph? How did he become the 38-year-old Joseph?
Well, that's the the church starts, and he becomes a leader, and then he's trying to enact, and people are drawn to that vision of the Book of Mormon, that those ideologies that suggest that the poor will be taken care of, that there's a new Jerusalem where the Savior will be and provide, and everybody's got inheritance. And so when the church is started, they gather. People come because they're also in the same situation. They're also poor. They also have nothing. They're also got terrible circumstances, and they want to improve them. And so they try and put the Book of Mormon into practice. And of course, the Book of Mormon is a story, not an actual event, and therefore it falls over. It falls over in Jackson County, Missouri. It falls over with the preaching of the gospel to the Lamanites. It falls over with the ideas of gathering and then being provided for. So when these things fall over, Joseph has to pivot. He's got to respond. Why didn't the promised blessings come forward? Joseph had just had a revelation from God that the New Jerusalem would be here, and then the New Jerusalem would be among the Lamanites. But when the Indian agents kicked out the missionaries, now it's Jackson County, which is on the borders of the Lamanites. And so that's the pivot. It's going to be there in Jackson County on the borders. But then when the saints get kicked out of Jackson County, it's now in Davis County with Adam Ondi Armin. And when the saints get kicked out of Missouri proper and they can't even go there, then it's now the new city of Joseph in Nauvoo. That's the place that they're going to get their inheritance. So these pivots happen because real life smacks up against ideas and Joseph's desires and other people who get in the way. So some of them have to be eliminated.
One of the early pivots you mentioned, the loss of the 116 pages. And, you mentioned here Jackson County and the Kirtland Bank and the Missouri expulsion. And there's even a pivot at the end with getting sort of caught in polygamy and the Nauvoo expositor, and over the next 9 months going to the Nauvoo High Council and all of that unfolding. And, his life is cut short, but he was in the middle of a pivot right there. That if he was allowed to live a little longer, we would have seen that play out. What I find interesting about these pivots is he says a thing is going to happen, or he leads the reader, the audience, the members to believe that life is going to unfold a certain way. It falls on its face. And he has this uncanny ability to go, all right, I'm just going to shift it, move it, change it, reinterpret it, go a different direction, and they will come along. And maybe with the exception of the Kirtland Bank scandal, when, whatever it was like 20% of members left and a large number of leaders walked away. About half the top leaders walked away. And that moment, it seemed like kind of fell apart for a moment. But in every other of these pivots, he just does pivot, and everything seems to just go with him. I'm sort of astounded that he doesn't run into more problems when he creates his own hiccups every step along the way.
Yeah, and look, he throws lots of people under the bus too, right? As being the reason why, you know, it hasn't worked. But that's the magic worldview. And, you know, if you're going back to what our friend said before, right? You know, it doesn't work because it's not been done exactly, or somebody has tripped up on the procedure, and so they become the scapegoat, and then Joseph moves on. So yeah, and that pivot often leads, and you're right, Bill, these pivots are throughout his life. Everything's a pivot. You know, the loss of the 116 pages is a pivot. I think a really big pivot is when they transfer from Harmony, Pennsylvania to Fayette, New York. That's a huge pivot. Joseph wasn't expecting to get kicked out of Harmony, or for it to be so dangerous for him to still be there. He was expecting to do all his work there, and then it went to Fayette, and the loss of the 116 pages, he didn't envision that either. But those two things actually were huge pivots that actually worked incredibly well for him, because he had to reinvent the beginning, which actually was better than what he had originally. So that was great. The Whitmers brought in, you know, so much because he was physically with them, and they basically underpinned the beginning of the church. So those losses, what he felt like were losses at the time, became huge advantages. And I guess that's part of the magic worldview. It's part of how we operate today too. We all say that, right? Oh, I lost that house or that particular opportunity, but a better one came along. And so you recreate yourself as the hero of the story, and that God is actually preparing you for something better. That's the story that you tell. And yeah, it's a joyful story for which we like to tell, how we are the hero and how God has maybe put this obstacle in our way, or this trials come up, or these enemies have attacked, but in the end we are triumphant. And then of course most of this pivot ends up in the Nauvoo church, which is quite different to the Kirtland church in lots of ways, quite different from the Book of Mormon. And Joseph's circumstance is completely different. He's prominent. People ask his advice. He's in charge. He directs. You know, like there's just so much that is different. It's a whole nother world, and he is.
Yes, one obvious example I've neglected to mention is the Book of Mormon is against polygamy, and yet by 1844, Joseph Smith can't get enough.
That's right.
Yeah.
The Book of Mormon's also against fine sanctuaries, right? And by Kirtland, he's built a temple, and then again in Nauvoo, he's building another temple, and now we build tons of temples, even though the Book of Mormon says, we can worship God in our heart. We don't need these fine sanctuaries. In fact, they're actually a definition of corruption.
Anti-Masonic views, and then the temple endowment is, Masonry, and I think of like Zion's camp and what was promised, sending people to Canada to find a treasure in a home, and it backfires and there's nothing there. And we all should have saw that coming.
That was Salem, right?
Salem, sorry. Yes. And every time he runs into these moments, you would think everyone goes like, man, that's the 17th time that I've been let down with the promise being broken and the thing not turning out the way it should turn out. And you would think everyone would turn and go.
Oh my gosh.
Somehow he fails at keeping his word over and over and over again. And these pivots, for all intents and purposes, work out because the church members generally keep following. He keeps growing the church and keeps amounting power and influence, although wealth is sort of evades him. Brigham Young takes advantage of that, though. He really becomes admired by his people no matter what he does.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But he was such a great storyteller, and success was just around the corner, and the second coming was next week.
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's a slide about the Godhead.
So here's I've got three examples here that I thought would take us through these kind of this trajectory, and maybe and give you a little insights that I think are worthy of sharing about particular aspects. So this one's the Godhead, and we this is a big part of Mormonism, of course, because we know the real Godhead. So this is we're the experts on it because Joseph saw God and Jesus back in 1820. But so one of the historical contexts of Godhead, which I think is so important, is to understand that we talk about Trinitarianism today, and there's a bit of back and forth between the church and lots of other Christian denominations based on Trinity and the idea of separate Godhead. And these kinds of debates have been happening for centuries, and they split groups of people, Protestants and Catholics and Protestant denominations all of the time, to the point where these are big matters of contention. And one of the biggest splits in particularly the 17th and 18th century was around modalism. So and modalism is it's kind of like the in between having a separate gods and having a trinity. So a trinity suggests three gods in one. Everybody, God the Father acts as God the Son, acts as the Holy Ghost, and they're all the same. The same. Whereas modalism suggests that there is one God, but that one God is acting in different modes at any given time. And this was a big Pennsylvania thing, because the founder of Pennsylvania was William Penn. And William Penn was a Quaker who advocated for modalism in England, and he was imprisoned because of his heretical understanding of the Godhead.
Yeah, the funny thing about modalism is that modalism is considered to be a heresy by Trinity believers. And yet the Trinity is so impossible to explain, because you can't explain the Trinity. As someone once famously said, if you think you understand the Trinity, you don't understand the Trinity. That what my experience has been is that often people who think they're believing the Trinity and claim to believe the Trinity will nevertheless inadvertently fall into the heresy of modalism in order to explain the Trinity. When they're talking about Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, it's like they're all water, but there's steam and there's water and then there's ice, right? Okay, that's modalism. That's a heresy. You talk about God like being the ice cream cone with the 3 scoops, the chocolate and the vanilla and the strawberry. That's modalism. It's a heresy. And the Book of Mormon ends up apparently promoting modalism. Now, the apologists will say, it's not Trinitarianism. But no, it's not, technically. What it looks like is a relatively, I'm not going to say uneducated, okay? But I'm going to say it's the attempt of a person to present Trinitarianism. I think it could be the attempt of a person to present Trinitarianism who, like so many others, is inadvertently using modalism to do it. What do you think? Do you think it's just intentionally presenting modalism as opposed to Trinitarianism?
Well, I think there's two things going on. Well, people were having massive debates about this. This was splitting churches. Like we think in our kind of more secular society now, the difference between a Presbyterian and a Methodist, does anybody know what the difference is? No idea. But, in early 19th century America, the difference between a Methodist and a Presbyterian was huge. These people were, having brawls on the side of the street, right? And of course, the difference between Protestantism and Catholics was massive because, it was just humongous. Now, nobody cares. So there's a few things going on. One is that Joseph's dad is a universalist. Now, a universalist believes that that Jesus is subordinate to the Father, and it's not really God incarnate. The Trinity, on the other hand, which was believed by many of the Protestant sects, including Presbyterianism, so Joseph's mother, was this idea of, God is God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, all the same. And I think that Joseph found in modalism that he was probably understood better when you got to Harmony, Pennsylvania. He understood that as kind of a way to explain and harmonize between his parents and their particular conflict, because it probably was one of those things that they argued about at home, and that actually was, their religious difference is another major issue in the Smith home, and something that Joseph was trying to reconcile. And modalism probably appealed to Joseph because it harmonized, and gave maybe a middle way, or both of his parents had to kind of compromise to do it. But
so in modalism, it would be appropriate, though, to say that Jesus is God, correct?
Yes, correct.
So between 1829 and 1832, the Book of Mormon and the early D&C isn't really a difference.
Correct. All those first three things, pre-Book of Mormon, Book of Mormon references, early Doctrine and Covenants, all very similar. You can
But
find.
then comes 1835. I'm sorry, but then comes 1835 and the lectures on faith, I bet.
Yep. And Sidney Rigdon's having a significant influence on the ways that God is being represented in Mormonism by this point.
You think Rigdon is the pivot? Rigdon's influence is what leads to God and Jesus being separate.
Yep.
And then you've got this other pivot of God as man, as the whole Lorenzo Snow couplet, and it goes back to things that Smith had taught. And what do you think is the pivot there?
So that's Joseph then taking that next idea and running with it, right? If God and Jesus are separate, and now we're saying that, okay, well, what's if they're separate entities, then is there an idea that God could be a person in human form, and therefore are we seeing God as a man? The idea that he just makes that next step. We can define God as being a man, therefore man can become a God.
Well, there's lots of people that believe that Jesus and God are different, including the J-dubs, but they don't go whole hog on man can become God. What's the difference there, do you think?
I think it satisfied, Joseph is is creating, like he's riffing, and these things make it really possible. And plus too, if he's thinking about, well, personally, I think he's seeing and creating a God that is like him, right? God is a man. God is a polygamist. God is married. God is heterosexual. God is he's the embodiment. Joseph becomes the embodiment of God, and therefore, he sees God in the ways that he thinks are important things to be.
I don't think you can untangle it from polygamy either. And what I mean by that is, when you tell a people, like, I want to practice polygamy, I want to be able to hang out with the 14-year-old chicks and have a good time, and I don't want people to second guess me. So I'm going to let them do it too. And by putting the theology behind it, that I'm going to take lots of wives and you're going to take lots of wives. And if you will all be obedient to this thing that seems weird and sort of seems unethical, and you're second guessing, but if you can just step forward and do the thing I'm asking you to do so that I can do it too, then you become a God. God did this and we're doing this, and we become that thing. And I think the man may become God and God was once a man. It nudges anybody in the 1840s who's being initiated into polygamy to press forward and do the thing that they're being asked to do and not to question it.
Yeah. I think that's, very, very, very possible. Very possible.
Yeah, and the idea that man can become God. Talk about manifest destiny.
Yeah. Gosh, it's a capturing thought too, right? What's the purpose of life? becoming like God. That's inspiring.
Yeah.
All right. I've got a couple of examples from Mosiah and the Doctrine and Covenants that show that kind of modalist type of God that ends up being in the Book of Mormon and in those early revelations. And you can go read those, but maybe we should go on to the next slide.
Yep.
And this is salvation. So, and we know from Joseph Smith's writing and his history, particularly even his 1832 history, he's really concerned about his standing before God. And that becomes a massive part of the Book of Mormon. What is your standing before God? Making sure that you are right in the sight of, deity. And that, again, is a difference from, Joseph's dad's universalist thinking, which is that everybody's going to be saved. Everybody is right in the sight of God. If not now, eventually will be. And in between, his mother's thought of, oh gosh, everybody's going to, everybody has to have a coming to Jesus moment. So salvation is something that Joseph becomes very attuned to, and I think probably more so after his son dies and he loses the 116 pages and he gets kicked out of Emma's Methodist church, right? He has a kind of a come to Jesus moment where he has to work out his salvation and what does that mean and what does that look like. And I think that's why we see him change from the lost 116 pages, which we know was probably more universalist, because that's the thing that Martin objects to in Doctrine and Covenants section 19, and we see him then become very concerned about salvation in
Okay,
Mosiah.
can we just slow down, because I just want to make sure I understand this. This is very I think important what you just said. Are you saying that the 116 pages, although we do not have them, that the doctrine in it was likely more universalist in nature than what we find in the rest of the Book of Mormon?
Correct. And we know that because of Doctrine and Covenants section 19, because when, just like we were talking about before, Joseph has to explain to Martin why the Book of Mormon that he's now looking at a year on from when Martin was the scribe is trampling on his universalist beliefs. God's punishment wouldn't have been in the 116 pages in the lost manuscript, because if it was, Martin wouldn't have had a problem with now the fact that it's there. The fact that Doctrine and Covenants section 19 exists is because there's a difference between what Martin thinks the Book of Mormon is and what he's now reading in the Book of Mormon manuscript that's now in front of him, and he's not happy, right? It tramples on his beliefs, and he doesn't want to publish the Book of Mormon. This is not what I signed up for. And Joseph gets the revelation that God's lying. He really does believe that everybody's going to be saved, but he just tricks people into believing that they're going to hell so that they'll comply and repent.
Oh, and the other part in that revelation to Martin Harris, don't tell anybody about this, by the way.
Yeah, don't tell anybody, because it's a high-end doctrine. It's the meat, and they're only ready for milk.
Interesting. I'm sorry. Go ahead and take us through this. So there's confusion, obviously, pre-Book of Mormon. Then in the Book of Mormon, you write that salvation is plainly set forth.
So the salvation in the Book of Mormon is very simple. Like it's well, gosh, perhaps we just read some of this. So this is Mosiah chapter 4, verses 1 to 6.
You call on God for mercy. You recognize that you're sinful. You call upon God for mercy, and then you are saved by the Holy Ghost and born again.
That's absolutely right. So there's no baptism in King Benjamin's sermon. There's no baptism in Abinadi's sermon. Even the baptism that Alma does at the Waters of Mormon is more symbolic. Like it's the idea that you've fallen down in front of Jesus and confessed that he's the Christ. That is the basis of salvation. And Benjamin and Abinadi, they all reiterate the idea that this is the only thing you have to do. So this changes during the actual dictation of the Book of Mormon by, it's still there in Helaman, chapter 3, but when Jesus shows up, he says that baptism is important. It is essential. You have to be baptized to be saved, which is great. That's the New Testament. I think that's probably influenced by Oliver Cowdery, because although Joseph's initial idea of salvation is just like the revivals that he's seen where people fall down and confess Jesus, Oliver's suggesting, well, baptism's important too. It says that in the New Testament. That then becomes a part of what Christ says in the Americas.
Which is important to point out that what Joseph Smith describes, or what the Book of Mormon describes in the first few chapters of Mosiah with the people of King Benjamin, and is preaching to them on the stand, and they're falling down because they're overcome by the power of the Holy Ghost, and then they get up and they claim to be saved. Joseph Smith is describing exactly what happened in his neighborhood at these camp revival meetings, or at least the Book of Mormon does.
Funny that. Yeah, look, and the idea of salvation changes again by Moroni. Remember, Moroni then suggests that actually you have to be baptized, but then you have to have the laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost. The gift of the Holy Ghost comes in Mosiah just because you've confessed to Jesus.
Yes.
But in Moroni, it's because you've been laid on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost. It's a physical act of ordinance, and this is different than it is in 3rd Nephi, because Jesus never suggests that and doesn't put his hands on anybody to receive the Holy Ghost. They just receive the Holy Ghost. But the Moroni seems to understand this, because it says in the text that this is the disciples heard this, but the other people didn't hear it, so it wasn't recorded, and when Christ's visit happened.
And Moroni knows it how.
Yeah, well, that's right. By the Spirit, maybe. I don't know.
I guess so. No, apparently the author of the Book of Mormon, by the time they were getting to Moroni, had gone up with the idea that they were going to be creating a church.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And we can correlate that with Doctrine and Covenants section 18, which is where in Fayette, New York, the Whitmers, or particularly David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery, are charged with making the church. So that doesn't happen till June of 1829 in Fayette, New York. And then Oliver Cowdery gets a revelation, and that revelation spells out the first kind of church handbook of how this is going to be organized. And that looks like it informs the text of Moroni. So that was written before the text of Moroni, which suggests that Oliver is becoming part of the creation process of the Book of Mormon. Prior to that, he's just a scribe, but by June of 1829, Oliver is now getting his own revelation, and that revelation is ending up in the Book of Mormon, which suggests that Oliver is now co-creator.
Interesting.
So
more on this one.
So then, just that baptism becomes a big part of the early Doctrine and Covenants, early part of the church. There's significant disaffection through the Kirtland Bank scandal, and then the expulsion from Missouri. So we see in Nauvoo, in the latter part of the Doctrine and Covenants, we see this idea of exaltation. So this reward, not just salvation, but the idea that there's going to be the godhood reward. You're going to be a god. This is the celestial kingdom. And we see, of course, in 1832, the idea of 3 degrees of glory, heaven, and then in Nauvoo we see the segregation of the celestial kingdom into 3 parts, where one of those parts is if you practice the new and everlasting covenant of marriage or polygamy, you can go to the highest degree of the highest heaven, the 3rd heaven, celestial glory, and that will enable you to be gods, to have progeny, to go on eternally. So
under the subjects of salvation, where does the second anointing come in, do you think?
So that comes in as in that period of time, in that exaltation period, where people are trying to assure their salvation, right? Back in Mosiah with King Benjamin, they're assured their salvation. They just have to keep the commandments and continue in faith. That will assure their salvation. But when you start to go, well, your salvation is dependent. There's a higher heaven, and your place in that heaven is some form of exaltation, then you need to be able to assure your exaltation. And so then that's the second anointing ordinance. And of course,
the certainty there would be a nice juxtaposition to the confusion in the pre-Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith. I'm sorry, were you going to say something, Bill?
No. My brain's running here as you guys are having this conversation, and I'm thinking about, again, D&C 19, and I'm thinking here about this pivot point and some of this earlier theology and exaltation, and the juxtaposition of Joseph Smith saying something like, I teach them good principles and I let them govern themselves, juxtaposed against all the manipulative tactics that are designed to get strict obedience and humiliation and shame if you run counter to Joseph Smith. The easy one to go to would be like Hiram Page, which is even early on using a seer stone, and Joseph Smith essentially creating an experience that just shames Hiram Page, destroys the seer stone, and says, don't anybody ever try that again. And there's this weird thing where on one hand, he wants to be known as the guy who lets his people decide for themselves how to live their lives, and he just gives them the good ideas to run with. And then the reality of a man who is determined to stay in control and to have obedience of his people and not to allow it to fall apart. And anyway, I'm just in my head sort of trying to work out some of that.
Well, even today, as you know, Elder Bednar is attaching the label of agency to you do what I tell you to do.
Yeah. It's more of the same. You're supposed to have the freedom to choose, and then the leaders tell you, no, sorry, that's not actually what it means. You actually have no freedom to choose.
Yeah, you lost your freedom to choose when you joined the church, pal.
Yeah. That's a weird thing too, right? To tell people there is free agency, but it's before you come in. And, everybody's born with free agency, but the moment you choose to get baptized, you're now under a different set of expectations and rules. And those rules, in spite of what leaders have said ever since the beginning of the church, including Joseph Smith, including prophets in the Book of Mormon, including other places. We just did something a couple weeks ago where free agency was mentioned by, maybe it was Jesus Christ himself in some revelatory 1886. That's what it was. The 1886 vision by John Taylor. Jesus uses the phrase free agency.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't actually get rid of it. Anyway, it's just such a strange thing how, because it's not true, it really does have the freedom to contradict itself and reinterpret things at any moment. And it does.
The other part of that is too, that prescription then means that if you can assure people, then that's very valuable, right? The second anointing becomes incredibly valuable, because if you can be assured that your salvation, or in this case, your exaltation, is going to happen, that can garnish all kinds of loyalty associated with it.
Yes.
Okay, let's do the next one. I think I've got one more on this example, and that's Kings. And we kind of talked about this before, because this is quite a fun one. Like democracy was a big part of the beginning of the United States, right? It's the 4th of July this week, and this is the beginning of the Republic, and the idea that men could take charge of themselves and determine.
I have to ask
destiny.
you something, Ganesh. Ganesh, I apologize.
Yeah.
We're on that first block. Do you mean to say under democracy? Do you mean to say 1767 or 1776?
That's sorry. That's supposed to be 1776.
Okay, I thought so. I was just wondering maybe something happened in 1767 I didn't know about.
Whoops. There's another mistake we need to correct. But yeah, look, yeah, that's what America will be entering its 250th year
Yes.
this 4th of July. So it's a really big deal. And of course, democracy was an experiment. Nobody had done this before. The idea that people would be in charge of themselves, that was ambitious. And there's some quite cool things around that I talk about in the book, but we won't have time to talk about it here. But and of course, the Book of Mormon is incredibly pro democracy. It has elections there, talks about corrupt kings. It gives numerous examples of kings and king men who are fighting against the freedom of everyday people. And of course, then the early church was framed under this idea of common consent, that people would be able to order themselves. And then we have Joseph in Liberty Jail talking about these weak men who have betrayed the church and betrayed Joseph and put him in prison for treason. And of course, when he manages to escape and develops Nauvoo's all about him. He's in charge, and then eventually he is crowned king. And the Council of 50 Minutes, which is 11th of April 1844, detail this event where he is positioned as prophet, priest, and king, and upheld in that capacity as a theocracy in Nauvoo going forward. And then I also give an example. So George Buchanan also talks later on about the idea that after Joseph's death, Brigham Young is then crowned king in Joseph's stead. And then John Taylor is crowned king on the 4th of February, 1885. So this was a pattern of the early church. Of course, this was abandoned with statehood, but this was meant to be the way it was. And so this is one of the fascinating pivots of Mormonism, the idea that it started off pro-democracy and republic and ended up in being the king men that it talked against in the Book of Mormon. This was Nauvoo. This was the Council of 50. And that's why it was so treasonous, and why Joseph was being held for treason in Carthage jail before his assassination. And this was meant to continue. And so when Brigham Young left Illinois and went to Utah Territory, he was king of that territory, and John Taylor after him. So this was how it's supposed to be. And yet, of course, we acquiesced to the United States, and therefore, we struck that out of our history because we don't want anybody to know how treasonous that Mormonism and Joseph Smith were.
Go ahead, RFM.
I was just going to ask that by April of 1844, when Joseph Smith gets himself crowned prophet, priest, and king, do you think it's fair to say or reasonable to conclude that the Mormons, by and large, had kind of lost their taste for the whole American experiment by that point?
Yes, absolutely. And I detail that with a number of different chapters: patriotism, the separation of church and state, because, effectively they felt, and Ben Parks makes this great point in his book Kingdom of Nauvoo, that really they felt like the United States had failed them, and I mean, the people outside of the church felt like these people were kingmen. They were creating their own theocracy. They were creating their own separatist society, and that wasn't the vision of America either, right? So these two ideas were in massive tension and were a big part of, the terrible events that happened in 1844.
You mentioned kingmen. I was gonna bring them up. You've got Joseph Smith having kingmen as characters in the Book of Mormon who are the bad guys. They're disrupting things. And then you fast forward, you've got the oath of vengeance in the temple. You've got sort of this alienation with outsiders, with America and their coming after the church in regards to polygamy. You've got the juxtaposition of July 4th and July 24th. I don't know a more patriotic people than Mormons. The most patriotic moments in my life was when Mormonism created an uber amount of patriotism within me. And then just a few weeks later, after July 4th, we celebrate this other holiday, which has to do with the saints trying to get away from the rest of America as far as they could, trying to create their own Deseret territory and state, getting so much hassle from the government, being persecuted over polygamy. Let me say it this way. Your book, I think, offers so many brilliant moments of you helping the reader see that Joseph was going down one track, presenting one set of ideas, and then something disruptive comes in or something contradictory happens. And by the way, many of them seem to be in that 1836 to 1839 time frame. I think that's interesting because of what's going on then with the mass exodus and apostasy and the Kirtland Safety Society Bank and his effort to get outside of just doing church things and starting to sense that he has the following of people that will allow him to now venture into other areas of the world besides just leading a religion. And what your book does is it presents just multitude of moments where Joseph and the church are going down one track and it is flipped on its head, and somehow he just smoothly orchestrates it in such a way that the train keeps going.
Yeah, well, and look, it's easy in hindsight to see that maybe it will feel like it was ordered, but actually it was pretty chaotic at the time. You read some of the journals of these people, and they are there's this lovely quote from Parley P. Pratt, during the whole Kirtland Bank scandal. And, he manages to reconcile with Joseph and continue being an apostle and, becomes one of the biggest supporters of things. But in that moment, he is talking about his despair at Joseph and Joseph's undue religious influence that is going to be the ruin of him, and so and you can't help but read Parley P. Pratt's letter to Joseph and just feel incredibly moved by it, which
because what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's just so sad, and yet Joseph manages to reconcile with him and pull him out, and it's not so bad for him, or save him slightly. Just fascinating. But some of these are incredibly chaotic, incredibly traumatic for the people involved. All right, shall we go on? What have we got next? Folk magic underpinning the church, and this is kind of, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but there is just so much. And I was so surprised when I started to read this. I mean, Bill, you talked about Quinn's book, but I hadn't been a study of that prior. But the idea that folk magic is just so much of what's going on. I've got the Smith magic parchments as a photo there, and also the seer stones of David Whitmer and Hiram Page. Those were held by the Community of Christ until recently. They sold them.
Is that a different Hiram Page seer stone?
Sorry?
I thought his got ground to dust.
Yes, well, actually, Martin Harris's brother says that in Utah, but it's not true. It doesn't. He didn't. It didn't get ground to dust. These are them here. This is the provenance of them is intact, and David Whitmer had a seer stone, which is why he he warmed to Joseph's seer stone. He didn't seem to be worried that Joseph didn't bring the plates from Harmony, Pennsylvania to Fayette, New York, because Joseph could see remotely in his seer stone the record wherever it was, if it was, because, David Whitmer had a seer stone. He understood seer stones and how they worked and how they remotely viewed things from a distance. So it wasn't a problem. The plates weren't in Fayette. Hiram Page used his seer stone to get revelations, passable revelations that the Whitmers and Oliver Cowdery totally believed, and talked about the New Jerusalem. And that's, Joseph had to stamp on that. That's Doctrine and Covenants section 28, and tell, God telling Oliver that he has to tell Hiram Page to give up his revelations and destroy them. So,
right. And significantly, as Bill Reel has pointed out before, the reason that God gives isn't because this is a bunch of hooey and whoever heard of getting the word of God from a rock. It's because the revelations are real enough, but they're coming from the devil.
Yeah. So how do you tell that your revelations from your rock are from God or from the devil? Gosh,
you have to shake a hand, I guess. The stones you've got in the picture here, where are the? I don't think I've ever seen this image before. Where are these two seer stones connected to, or is this like, what is that image and what's going on there?
So those two, those were photographed by the Community of Christ. So Lachlan Mackay, the apostle in the Community of Christ, sent me this photo. He talked about it. I went to a conference and he was talking about David Whitmer's seer stone. I said, can you do we have a photo? He said, yes, we took photos before they sold these, but these are the stones. This is David Whitmer's seer stone. I'm not sure which one's which, and Hiram Page's seer stone.
The reason looks like, go ahead, RFM.
I was going to say one of them, if not both of them, look like a gorget.
Yeah,
it might have a leather band through them and then wrapped around the neck.
Yes, and that actually, when I here's another.
This is Mark Hoffman's fraudulent. Mark Hoffman created this, and he created a provenance for it. It's all fake. It might be a Native American. Say that word again. Gorget. Yeah, gorget. This might have originally been one of those of a Native American thing, but Mark Hoffman created a fake provenance for it. But what Hoffman always did was Hoffman went back to other things in history that were real. And again, notice the similarity in the look between the David Whitmer seer stone and that Hoffman seer stone. And he is playing on the design, the two holes, the gorget appearance. And it's a side tangent, but I just wanted to show that and at least explain like the similarity and how Hoffman worked.
It's a really important one, because when Thomas Murphy saw this photo, because when I was talking to Lachlan Mackay about this, Lachlan said that Thomas Murphy saw this photo and said, these are Native American artifacts. These aren't, that's what they are. And the Community Price had already sold these stones, so they didn't have them anymore. But Lachlan was really sorry. He was like, if we had understood that, we wouldn't have sold them, and we would have returned, put them in a place that, it's Dan Vogel saying the one on the right is David Whitmer's. So, yeah, there you go.
Well, he means left.
That other right. Okay, the left one. So, but yes, so yeah, these are Native American artifacts, and of course, these are the kinds of things that people would have seen as being special, and then felt like they were so special that they could, give power to the seer to be able to utilize. So everybody in Joseph's world, everybody connected to the Book of Mormon, all of the first witnesses, the 3 and the 8, all came from this magic worldview. They had, Joseph Smith Sr. had seer stones and divining rods, had visions. Martin Harris had visions. Oliver Cowdery had a divining rod. Of course, that's Doctrine and Covenants 8 and 9. He received revelations, presumably through his divining rod, the June 1829 Articles and Covenants. David Whitman had a seer stone, Hiram Page had a seer stone, and he's receiving revelations on Zion, which are clamped down in Doctrine and Covenants section 28. So these are what these everybody, the first maybe 50 to 100 members of the church, were connected deeply to the magic worldview. And it's interesting to see that those are all the witnesses, and the people who are not connected, like Emma Hale, Joseph's wife, she's not connected to the magic worldview. She's not allowed to be a witness. She's not allowed to see the plates. She's a scribe, and she's presumably worked around Joseph as he's, utilized the seer stone and been intimately connected with all of those events. And yet Doctrine and Covenants section 25 says, and she's obviously grumpy about the fact she's not a witness, because that's part of the appeasement of Doctrine and Covenants section 25, is that she is not allowed to see them, just like the world, and she has to wonder. So those things to me are very telling that, this is the only people that are being trusted with these kind of these prominent positions are, those who had this folk magic worldview.
Do you think if you have the folk magic worldview, you're more likely to see stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. And so these are the 5 chapters I have on folk magic: treasure seeking, seer stones, slippery curse, guardian spirits, and special knowledge. And just like we looked at those other examples, they're tracking from pre-Book of Mormon Joseph, and what's happening with those, what those references are in the Book of Mormon, how they're playing out in the early church, what pivot points we see. One of the big pivot points for treasure seeking, Doctrine and Covenants 111 is a treasure dig. Bill, you alluded to that earlier, where Joseph and Hiram and Sidney and Oliver go to Salem, Massachusetts to look for treasure. It's a treasure dig.
Did you find any documentation suggesting that a seer stone was used?
So Joseph stopped keeping a journal at that particular time, and there's only a couple of letters, so we don't have anything to say that a seer stone was used in that particular treasure dig. But it seems likely, because Joseph is using a seer stone the whole of his life. I mean, the words change, right? It's changed to Urim and Thummim, and so it's kind of revised. But we know that he used the Urim and Thummim. He showed it to people, which is his white seer stone, at least, for the translation or the production of the Book of Abraham. But so we know he's using that, but the historical record doesn't always have all of the information that we'd like to connect these things together.
It is interesting that Mormons still believe that each and every one of them, if they are true and faithful and exalted, will each receive their own seer stone, which will be white and which will have their new name written in it. And by looking in the seer stone, they will be able to see things pertaining to a higher order of kingdoms.
Yeah. And this is folk magic. This is New England folk magic that was transported into Western New York by all these refugees who are fleeing economic ruin during the summer of no the summer of no sunlight.
Summer.
The year of no summer.
The year when there was no, what was it? There's no summer. The year when there was no summer. By the way, with an assist, they get the white seer stone with an assist from the Book of Revelation, just so everybody knows that we're aware of that.
Yeah. So, and you can see that when you order, and this goes back to the earlier point, when you order the accounts as close to the chronology as you possibly can, because it's obviously the historical record's not complete. You start to see that when we're talking about ministering angels in the church, that you can actually trace that to that treasure guardians. And there's the earliest accounts about the acquisition of treasure, the plates, are much more like a treasure guardian, a spirit treasure guardian that is part of folk magic than it does about an angel. You know, even the idea of this person being Moroni, that doesn't come up in the historical record, the person Moroni, until, you know, 1832, 1833. You know, Moroni, it's sometimes confused as Nephi too. It's just this evolves and it solidifies, and then it's backdated into the historical record so that you can kind of get a idea that it's solid. But when you go back to the earliest accounts, you realize it's an evolving story that becomes something faithful much later.
It is interesting that so many of these elements do show up in the Book of Mormon itself, as if the ancient Nephites practiced New England folk magic.
Yeah. The slippery curses is the easiest one, right? The slippery treasure, the idea that, you know, you put something down, then tomorrow it's gone. You know, that it can be transported under the ground by curse. Yeah.
And of course, the seer stone in Alma 37, which even gets its own name, if it's not the name of the person who has the seer stone, of Gazalem.
Yep.
Will shine forth out of darkness.
And we know that Joseph uses the word, the name Gazalem, as his code word in a number of revelations that obscure his name.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all just really interesting things. And like treasure digging happens the whole of, it happens before the Book of Mormon. We see it in the Canadian Revelation. We see it in the sending of the missionaries to find the New Jerusalem in Indian Territory. We see it in Salem, Massachusetts in 1836. We see it, we see it in the Book of Mormon, right? The Nephi and his brothers on these treasure quests to get the gold, the brass plates in this case, and then to treasure quests to go get, wives. These are adventures that Joseph is going on and relating, and it's Joseph. Everything's Joseph. It's always Joseph. It's Joseph as events. And when you see it in the chronology, you start to, and then you see it over and over and over and over again, you realize that this is a pattern, and it's built on a particular worldview, a particular idea of how things magically, come to pass. And this is Christian magic, right? He's not practicing the occult, but he's got his different ideas about how to make things a reality in this esoteric world, this hidden world behind everything.
Ganesh, I know we're winding down, but you have just said it's Joseph, 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 right? Famously Brigham Young's final words as well. But I wanted to ask you, before this is over, and this seems like a good time, you quoted Jan Ships as saying that you can't understand the mystery of Mormonism without solving the mystery of Joseph Smith. Do you feel that through writing this book, Ganesh, you have solved the mystery of Joseph Smith?
Yes and no. Like, yes, in the sense of I can show you all these. This is a book about ideologies, and I can show you the ideologies in the chronological order on every single one of these particular topics, all related to Joseph. So yes. But I think there's 2 more books to be written. And the next one would be, where's the content coming from for things like the Book of Mormon? So I think that's and then how is this being brought together in some kind of magical world way? And I think that's those are yet to come, those kinds of understandings. So yes, I think you can get a huge amount of there's 45 examples, 60 data points. This is, I hope, each example. So yeah, this is a good place to start.
I think it's fascinating you say that one of the books yet to be written is Where Did the Content Come From? Grant Palmer, I think, attempted to tackle that in Mormon Origins and Insider's View. And no offense to Grant, no negative about, I think he moved he gave us progress in that arena by far. But there was things about that book that I felt like were a stretch. And I think that we've come so far. Adam Clark's commentary and Terrell Gibbons talking about the library that Joseph Smith had. And it was after Palmer's book, but years ago, I was at the church history, not the library, but their building, their church history facility with Stephen Harper and Mark Ashurst McGee. And I was hanging out with Brian Whitney, and he was on a project where on his desk, he had 4 or 5 old books of sermons from the 1820s, 1830s that would have come from upstate New York, ministers that traveled around and their writings. And he was amazed at how much Book of Mormon phrases or sentences or theological ideas were things that were written among the ministers of the day in Joseph Smith's backyard.
Yeah, I think Ganesh quoted Richard Bushman to that effect in your book, didn't you?
Yes,
about how you
absolutely.
can Google certain phrases from those kinds of sermons.
Yeah. And and I think Bushman said that in the interview that I had with him on Mormon Discussion years ago.
Yes, that's the one that I quoted.
Yeah. And so I'll just note, I think you're right. One of the things that could be done is an updated analysis of where we know everything came from. And I think we're much further ahead than where Grant was. And I think that book deserves to be written by somebody.
Yeah, I think that my book at least gives you the ideologies and many of the underpinning cultures that are going on. So then, what are those words? Well, where the words come from?
Yeah, it's interesting you do say that, Ganesh, but I understand why now, because I'm quite familiar with the contents of the Book of Mormon. I've read it a lot. I've studied it a lot. And so based upon this book, I see it as answering that question as where the content of the Book of Mormon came from. In other words, I don't need somebody to put it up there and show me this is where the Revolutionary War stuff is. And this is where, the Republic is. And this is where the Methodist sermons are, because I know all those things. And so I just think it's amazing. I think the Book of Mormon is really an open book, and what it reads like is early 19th century United States.
Yeah, great. Well, that's quite an endorsement, and I'll take it.
What else do you have as far as slides go?
Okay, just a couple of fun ones to finish off. And I just wanted to share. Look, Joseph. This is a topical biography, so I have to end it every time with Joseph dying. Spoiler alert: Joseph dies every single chapter of this book, because that's where it ends. And I noticed that when I started to look at all of these different topics, most of them had an impact on Joseph's death. Things that people just were threatened by, felt terrible about, undermined their core values, and this were the basis of why Joseph was in Carthage jail for treason and subsequently murdered. So I just wanted to highlight 5 of these groups of people and some of their concerns that they really harbored because they were core values to them. Illinois Governor Thomas Ford wrote a book, about his experience as governor, and a lot of it covered, the experience of around Nauvoo and Joseph Smith, and gosh, Constitution, freedom of the press, Joseph's, search and seizure things, unlawful detaining. These were things that Thomas Ford was livid about. And also kingship. He spoke about that. Nearby towns like Warsaw and Carthage and even Quincy, the militarization that was going on with the Nauvoo Legion, Joseph's presidential platform, his harboring of criminals and getting them off with habeas corpus, and including himself, and the idea of being crowned king, which was supposed to be a secret in the Council of 50 Minutes, of course, but this was leaking out to the wider public. These were all things that the nearby towns they were aghast by, and this was crazy town. They were so worried. Neighboring states like Missouri and Iowa, Joseph's army, was threatening war. They were concerned about Indian alliances, and they were trying to extradite Joseph because he escaped from Missouri. Remember, it wasn't that he got let go or that they found him not guilty or something like that. He escaped Missouri, so they tried to extradite him, but this was back before. What do you do between states? States have kind of sovereignty, so extradition, that kind of stuff didn't really exist then. This Joseph was kind of the test case, and he used it to his advantage, and he thwarted them on many occasions. His impending theocracy and his just general treason that the United States was failed, those were all massive deals to neighboring states. Church leadership, even, people like William Law, William Marks, Sidney Rigdon, there were lots of issues with, and many on the High Council. Polygamy was obviously something that they were concerned about. Various theology practices, the idea of man as God, and when William Law and others published the Nauvoo Expositor, you go through and there are a number of concerns, and they're not just about polygamy. They're about, the version of God that Joseph is preaching, the whole idea of Protestant. There are multiple concerns. Secret police that Joseph is instructing, that second anointing absolution that people are getting, violence that is being enacted in the background, and even Nauvoo citizens, right? The elitism that there's this kind of specialist group who are getting, special treatment and land, and there's fines in the city. People are getting fined for all kinds of things, and there's tax, burdensome taxation. Joseph is utilizing the legal system in the courts because he's the Nauvoo judge, to get away with all kinds of things. And there's counterfeiting happening. So there are multiple issues by multiple people that people are concerned about. This is not just we don't like polygamy or we don't like Joseph. These are really core central ideas that Joseph is trampling on and changing. Some people think that's amazing, right? He's redefining the whole system. But other people, this is their safety net, and he is, cutting it out, and they're falling through. So, I just wanted to highlight that, because I think that for lots of people, particularly once you come to understand the real historical Joseph, he's terrible. He's doing some horrific things that if somebody was doing that in the United States today, he would be a terrible person.
What happened to 23-year-old Joseph?
Well, he got wealthy, he got powerful, and he got entitled, and just did what he wanted to do, and then he became a mob boss. Really, Nauvoo was, it was the mafia. That's how people were feeling. The inner people were thinking that this was amazing. We're getting a whole lot of privilege. Those people who are on the edges, the margins, and those people who are on the outside, they were feeling incredibly threatened. This could mean their death. So they killed him first. He was such a threat. They stormed the jail. They didn't believe that the justice system would bring him to account. So they did vigilante system and vigilante law. And so here's just a few photos of paintings, pictures of some of we talk about it as if it's a martyrdom, and for that became a really great story that Brigham Young was able to incite people. You're being persecuted because Joseph was assassinated in jail when he should have been safe by Governor Ford's decree. That everybody's against you, everybody hates you, come with me, I'll take you to another place where you can thrive. But this martyrdom story, when you look at what was the complaints against Joseph and the evidence that suggests what was going on in Nauvoo and surrounding areas at his hand, it was a shit show, and people were right to be worried. And members of the church who find this stuff out, they get really worried by this. It's not just the polygamy; it's it tramples on whole lots of really core values for people, and that's why it's so hard.
Let me ask you your opinion about this. Do you think it was John Taylor who shot Joseph Smith, or was it Willard Richards?
You're asking me to weigh in on that important historical moment. Well, look, nobody's in that jail cell, right? And can tell exactly what happened. But I think there's a multiple ideas. Was he taken out by other people? Was he taken out by his own? Did he take himself out because he knew that he could be tortured, and who knows? That's a fascinating question, and I'm sure we could spend hours talking about that.
John Taylor it is. Okay, then here's the fifth and final slide. I think it's the final slide. Joseph created the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, I think there's a couple more slides, but look, I wanted just to highlight this because this is where it all started, right? That presentation by William Davis talking about the performance aspect of the Book of Mormon. And it's really important and key to know the Book of Mormon is not a book. It's a play, right? It's a performance that's being transcribed in the moment. The room is the stage, the hat and the rock are the props, the scribe and whoever other occupants of the house are the audience. They are getting it in real time. And we'll see in the next slide that actually people are reading it immediately. It's not like they're waiting to the end and then reading, it in its entirety. They are reading it on a daily. The dialogue is crafted and memorized, but the execution is dynamic. So, Joseph is able to go off script. He's able to go off on a tangent, come back to it. He's got a plan, but he's flexible, and he can tell how the mood takes him, or how his particular audience, whether it's the scribe or the household that might be listening, how they're feeling about it, and he might be able to wax lyrical. So and of course, once one performance is done, the script that influences the next act. So it's not like, Joseph has an outline. He knows what's going to happen eventually, but it doesn't have to happen right away. The next scene might be completely different just because of the reaction to the previous information. So, and I wanted to highlight your RFM, your Book of Mormon challenge that you did when you podcasted during the during COVID, but also that you were presenting on that at Sunstone. Is that you proved the point that Joseph is a podcaster, right? He's got an idea of what he wants to say. He's saying it in the moment. Of course, he's getting a reaction. So therefore, that's what finding out what the audience wants. So he's giving them more of that if he possibly can. He's got some ideas that he wants to flesh out, but he's also influenced by what reaction he's getting. And so those things we see in the text. And when you order it by its dictation sequence, like our good friend Brent Metcalf did with the Mosiah priority, you can see those things unfold, and you can point to them. So, and they're great predictors of what's going to happen. We can see when he moved from harmony to Fayette, because the text of the Book of Mormon changed. Oh, which is what I want to talk about next. So let's just go to the next slide.
Okay.
So actually, just before we do that, so we know that the Book of Mormon text is being used immediately, because in Doctrine and Covenants section 11, which is a revelation to Hiram Smith, the text says, "But now hold your peace, study my word," and further on down, "that which is now translating the Book of Mormon, until you have obtained all which I shall grant to the children of men." So Joseph is, the revelation, the command to Hiram is to study the Book of Mormon. This is in May. The Book of Mormon hasn't finished yet. He's studying it as it's rolling off the press, as it's rolling off the, while the ink's drying. Hiram is part of the audience in May of 1829, and the Whitmers are part of the audience in June of 1829. They are listening to this in the moment. They are reading it that night, and they are commenting on it and pontificating about it, which sets the stage for what Joseph is going to address the next day during the next session of dictation.
See, that's such a great insight for me personally, because I just have this view of him doing it all on his own in a vacuum. But of course, he's got an audience, just like I have an audience. And like I will sometimes modify in order to respond to what audience people have to say, audience members have to say. Yeah, he's getting immediate feedback. This is exciting. This is in some ways, it's a group effort. He's the voice for it.
Yes. And they, and we see the text change because of the influence of particular people's understandings and prejudices. They make their way into the text. So we know that this is happening.
Yeah. You pointed out one earlier. I mean, you mentioned D&C 19 was really a way in which the characters of the Book of Mormon, because we're talking D&C, but this happens in other places too. In D&C, Joseph Smith is using the voice of God, but the voice of God gets to break the fourth wall and tell Martin Harris why things were one way before but are another way now. And so as he explains why universalism showed up when we were translating before, and now I'm using these words differently, and so let me smooth it over by saying that things like eternal damnation doesn't exactly mean what the rest of the Christian world thought eternal meant. Joseph gets to continually use the material he's creating to blend what happened before the pivot with what happens after.
And then the other, this goes on, right? Because in the early church, Joseph is getting revelations. Those revelations are being copied. So there's multiple copies of them, and people are taking them and utilizing them, because they're traveling and they're preaching and they're going to different congregations. There are multiple copies of these revelations in different handwritings and different journals, as they're going, because Joseph is used to the idea that the moment that it's written down, it is going to be used. He's not waiting till the project is finished for it to be used. It's happening in the moment. It's happening that day, that week. The church publications are a good example of that, because even with the Book of Abraham or even other instances, those things are being printed for the general membership before even the project is finished. So
you're citing to this passage as evidence for the idea that Hiram is studying the Book of Mormon as it's dictating and not waiting for it to be published so he can read the whole thing.
Correct. Yeah. Let's go to this next slide. What we got? Okay, so this goes back to what you're just saying, Bill, about the fourth wall. So the fourth wall, for those who don't know, so when you're watching a movie, you can't talk to the actors, but if you're watching a play, the actors on stage may actually interact with the audience, and that's called breaking the fourth wall. So I do comedy, which means that I'm on stage, I'm crafting jokes, I'm saying them out in the audience, and sometimes the audience heckles or comments, and the moment that they do that, I'm engaging with the audience in real time with the information that's in there, right? So suddenly they're now part of the performance, because even though I'm on stage and they're in the audience, they are part of the performance now. And we see this in the text of the Book of Mormon. So I wanted to give you some examples. And so, in June of 1829, Joseph and Oliver moved to Fayette, New York. They leave Harmony because persecution's so great. There's not much elaboration about what this persecution looks like, but they have to leave. It's over. Fourth Nephi, I believe, is the reason why it's one chapter and it covers like 300 years is because Joseph's in a hurry. He's leaving and he needs the Book of Mormon to be finished. So Amaron is going to hide the record in the hill. That's the record he's going to pick up, right? Because we don't have Moroni yet. It's just Amaron. And so he goes to Fayette and he finds that actually he can't recover the lost manuscript, so he has to keep working on the Book of Mormon. And the Whitmers, which he didn't know because they are Oliver's friends, or David Whitmer is Oliver's friend, they're actually really receptive and they love what he's doing and they revere him as a prophet. And he's going to come up with more content because they're now reading the Book of Mormon and they've got questions and they've got thoughts and understandings. And so there's something really kind of cool that I think happens from Mormon onwards. So Mormon, Ether, Moroni, First and Second Nephi, Jacob. We don't see this anywhere else there's some hints at the beginning, but it really becomes a big thing in Mormon. And that is where the speakers, the prophets of the Book of Mormon speak to the audience. This is called second person narrative, right? So first person is I, Ganesh, do all these things. Third person is we went to the store, right? But when I, as the voice, addresses the audience, so those out there in the internet right now listening to this particular podcast, you guys, that's called second person narrative, right? I'm not just talking to RFM and Bill. I'm now talking to the audience who is listening. This is what happens. Mormon, in Mormon chapter 3, says, therefore I will write unto you, Gentiles. I write unto you all. I write unto you that you may know that you must all stand before the judgment seat of God. Ether chapter 5, which is Moroni, he says, ye shall know that I have authority when ye shall see me, and we shall stand before God at the last day. He's addressing the reader. Moroni chapter 10, also Moroni, saying, I bid unto thee farewell. He's addressing the audience. Second Nephi 33, I speak unto you as the voice of one crying from the dust. So here, incorporating that Isaiah imagery. Jacob chapter 6, which is Jacob this time, I bid you farewell until I shall meet you before the pleasing bar of God. So, it's not just that the Book of Mormon is talking about these ancient people, right, doing these ancient Christian things. The writers are addressing the reader and compelling the reader through this relationship that you're going to tell that I am telling you the truth, because we're going to stand side by side as we are up at the bar of Christ, and I'm going to have to give an account, and this is true, and you're going to have to give an account that you didn't listen to me or did listen to me when you read the Book of Mormon.
Right, whether my sins are still on your skirts or not.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you this. I cannot think of any place in the Bible, old or new. I can't think immediately. It's a big book. Of any place where it does this, where it breaks the fourth wall and addresses the reader directly. Can you think of any place like that? You or Bill, anybody out there in the Bible?
I don't know. There might be. Gosh, it seems like I don't know if it's a literary technique that is only, more recent than maybe the first and third person. But yeah, I can't think of anything directly.
Now, obviously, Paul is writing letters to people and he's addressing them as you, but that's not us, right?
Isaiah tends to have a lot of kind of the language that suggests that's drawing the reader into the text. Maybe that's partially second person.
All I know is I was surprised when I was reading a number of years ago Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, his collected poems, and found some instances toward the end where he does the exact same thing as Moroni did or does, and I was startled to find him addressing me directly.
It makes it more personal, right? Like in the book, I have a note from the author to the reader. Like it's where I say, this is at the end of all of this whole thing, this is what I think, right?
It's like a letter.
It's a letter,
personal letter.
And it draws us into relationship, right? Because if you're getting a personal letter from somebody, right, it's because they love you, and you respond by loving them back. So you can love Mormon and Moroni and Nephi and Jacob because they've talked to you. You've felt them talking to you. You've said their words out loud.
Would like James 1:5 apply, RFM? If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, shall be given him. It's a bit of that sort of thing, but it's not as.
It's kind of any of you, if anybody lacks wisdom. That's kind of a general principle. But I hear what you're saying. If any of you, yeah. That's an interesting idea. Anyway, I just think it's really, on the one hand, I go, right, well, you're writing this to anybody who writes the book. So I happen to be reading the book. I mean, anybody who reads the book you're writing to. I happen to be reading the book. It's not that special. But on the other hand, I have to say that those parts in the Book of Mormon, like at the end of 2nd Nephi, like Jacob, like Moroni's farewell, those are among the most powerful parts and always were among the most moving parts in the Book of Mormon to me, and I know to others as well.
And in the dictation sequence, this only happens in Fayette.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think that when he goes to Fayette and meets with the Whitmers, he's just exposed to a whole nother way of thinking, and so there's a number of things that the Whitmers inadvertently add to the Book of Mormon, like and you've probably seen my podcast with Mormonish on Catholicism, right? Catholicism is similar. It only comes up in the Book of Mormon in Fayette. So in Mormon, Moroni, 1st and 2nd Nephi, these anti-Catholic passages only come up at the end of the dictation sequence in Fayette, which suggests that the Whitmers, it's a bigger audience, right? There's a whole household of people, but they and Joseph is attuned to what their concerns are, and one of their concerns are Catholics. They're the great and abominable church, and they're making sense of revelations, and this appeals to Joseph, and so that Catholic understanding is becomes a big thing. But the idea that this only comes up and shows that it's Joseph in the dictation sequence. He's being influenced by his audience. He's
so
talking
bottom
to
line
them.
is the Book of Mormon is an anti-Catholic document in certain instances where it talks about it. Yeah, it's very anti-Catholic. And even though Bruce R. McConkie recognized that and acknowledged it in his first edition of Mormon Doctrine, because he shared the sentiment of the Book of Mormon about the Catholic Church, then he kind of got hauled up a little bit on that and made to modify that. And now the Great and Abominable Church isn't the Catholic Church. It's basically any church that isn't the Mormon Church. So we're spreading it around, right? So we're not anti-Catholic anymore. But the Book of Mormon is anti-Catholic. So once again, we have this whole idea that Mormons walk around just with this one example of the Book of Mormon is anti-Catholic, but we're not against Catholics. It's like we have to keep all these contradictory ideas in our head at the same time as Mormons.
Yeah. And it does, for some people who are anti-Catholic, that was a major, feature of their conversion, But for other people who don't care, and I don't think that Joseph particularly cared. I don't think he was anti-Catholic. I think he just, it was just that the Whitmers were so anti-Catholic that he adopted that for that particular time period, because we see him make a major change and a major pivot, and that's one of the chapters in the book, in 1836 when he's in Salem, Massachusetts, and he goes to a convent, and it's been burnt down, and he has some empathy for these poor Catholics who are being persecuted in their minority, and he, and he changes his tune, and from then on, he only speaks about Catholic people positively.
Yeah, that was something I had not known before, and I thought that was really interesting. In and amongst a bunch of other interesting things, this incident in August, it was, of 1836, and I had not heard of this before. You got it on page 440 of your book, that Joseph Smith goes by a burned down convent, and he's apparently quite touched by it. And that may be something that ends up turning him, because the Book of Mormon, anti-Catholic as hell. And then Joseph Smith does have this experience. And then after that, Joseph Smith, it has sentiments that are expressed and published and documented that are very pro-Catholic and sympathetic to the Catholics.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it just so speaks to Joseph as a human developing, right? And I don't think in his early life he cares really, but then the Whitmers really care, so he adopts that, and then he has his own experience which changes his viewpoint, and so he has a completely different view as a adult in Nauvoo than he did as a boy in Fayette.
And you suggest that this may be an answer to the age-old question of why is it that Joseph Smith never refers back to the Book of Mormon in any of his teachings?
That's correct, because he changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the Book of Mormon is Joseph Smith 101.
Yeah,
or 1.0. 1.0.
Well, the early Doctrine and Covenants is very much like the Book of Mormon. In fact, I did example after example after example of how the early Doctrine and Covenants is in line, supports, backs up the Book of Mormon. Absolutely. So, but then there's this pivot, right? This pivot where Joseph changes for whatever reason, and he's different. He's different in Nauvoo. So it's no use talking about the ways that he felt about polygamy when he was 23 years old, because now he's got some side pieces, and so he's just not going to talk about that again, right?
Now he's gone through puberty.
He's gone through puberty.
A lot of people are saying they're really excited about your book. They want to be able to get a copy. How do they get a copy of your book, Ganesh?
Well, the easiest way is Amazon. You can go on Amazon, you can get a print version, you can get an ebook version. If you are in Salt Lake, you should be able to go to Benchmark Books and get a copy too, if you want to see it in your hands. Hopefully at some point there'll be an audio version. But if I have a preference, get the print version, just because then you can underline it and correct it, and you can email me, things that you think should be different, or the additions or other things you like. The reason it took so long to do this thing is that there are just so many things. There's 1,350 historical references in here. Like, it took forever, and I still didn't get them all. And you could spend the whole of your life doing the Joseph Smith Papers Project and find new data points. They're just everywhere. And since I stopped writing because I had to give something to the formatter to format, I started to find more things in the Doctrine and Covenants that didn't even make it way into the book that I think were important. It's ongoing. Hopefully this will be a reference book, but it's going to need to have an update at some stage with the information that everybody's discovered.
Okay.
Before we go to phone calls, I just want to let folks know 662-667-6667. We do have Gene's down below, and so we'll bring him in here to the studio in a moment. But if you want to call the phone line or visit the show, I did ask AI, so don't judge me, RFM. I know you're not really big into letting AI be the expert in saying something, but I did ask it about the fourth wall thing, about the the Old and New Testament versus the Book of Mormon.
Oh, okay.
And it noted in John chapter 20 verses 30 to 31, and it's important to note John is the latest of the four gospel writers, certainly not one of the apostles.
That's where it's talking about if everything that Jesus did were written down, although the world couldn't hold the books, it would be written.
And it's John 20 verses 30 through 31. It says, "And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God." But as you noted, when I mentioned James 1:5, you noted that it doesn't quite seem the same. And AI said this. It said, while the Bible does use this rhetorical technique, the Book of Mormon amplifies it dramatically, particularly in its closing chapters. The biblical authors often aim at a broader communal or liturgical audience, whereas the Book of Mormon's direct speech feels personal, testimonial, frequently urgent, more like someone's bearing witness in a revival tent rather than penning a doctrine from the pulpit. This difference may reflect Joseph Smith's 19th century revivalist environment, where speaking directly to the hearer or reader was common in religious tracts or testimonies. That influence seems to bleed through into his scripture, shaping both form and tone. So there's that. And then before we go to the phone calls, I just want to note, folks, about 1/3 of you are not subscribed to the channel. Would you please subscribe? Hit the button, hit the bell so that you get notifications when new episodes come out, and hit the like. That helps get this episode in front of more people. I'll put the link, Ganesh, to the Amazon option to buy it in the chat here as we finish out the episode, so folks can buy the book. And then, folks, if you would at least consider supporting the program, go to mormonismlive.org, click donate, click the donate button, and that'll take you to a donor box portal where you can donate to our work here with this show, Mormonism Live, and help us create content like this going into the future. And then one last thing, which is we have that event on August.
Yeah, we're going to be in Utah. Well, you're in Utah now. I'm going to be in Utah in a month's time. And we're going to be doing a couple of events. One's on August 2nd. That's Saturday evening. That's the Bill and Me show. That's exactly what it's called. Radio Free Mormon and Friend. And we're going to be having that. I can't even remember where, but it's going to be in Salt Lake City. And we have, I think, 50 tickets that are available, and 33 have been bought. Is that correct?
60 tickets, and 38 have already been purchased. So there is 22 tickets remaining. Those will be sold out. So you are going to want to register for that as soon as possible, because once they're sold and you want to show up, that's not going to be possible. So please do that as soon as you can. And I will put that into the chat as well, so that folks can come to that event and get a ticket for it. So August 2nd in Salt Lake.
And on the 4th. And on the 4th is a Monday. We're going to be doing a live audience for the Mormon newscast. So it's going to be you, me, and Rebecca. That will be called Radio Free Mormon and Friends, plural. And you can be there for the actual show. And we're going to hang out afterward and have a great time and talk. And is it the total like 4 hours for that, Bill?
We will open up the doors at 5:30, and that will run. And the show will start at 6. Right. And after the show is over, we'll do a kind of a mingling with those of you in attendance till 10 o'clock. And then at 10 o'clock, we need to get out of there as soon as we can.
Okay. Well, this all sounds like a lot of fun to me. And how many of those have sold? That's 15 have sold out of how many?
Yeah, we just started selling those like a week and a half ago. And let me go back to that page. But I think 13 of those have sold already. 13 tickets there have sold. So there is only 37 more of those. And as we get closer, those I almost can guarantee those will sell out as well. So folks, there is limited space. And if you want to come to that, you're going to want to do that. I did put the August 2nd information into the live chat. And I just now put the live Mormon newscast into the live chat. And here in about another 30 seconds, I will add Ganesh, your book from Amazon in our donation link if folks want to support the show. So other than that, I've got Gene down below, and we can bring him on if you guys are ready for him.
Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, great.
Gene, how are you?
Good. Everything's going well. I was at the Radio Free Mormon and Sunstone 3 years ago, where Radio Free Mormon did his magic presentation. If Joseph Smith did magic, sort of.
Did you like that?
It was awesome.
Cool.
And so, and also, might not Ganesh warm up the crowd for the newscast evening?
Yes.
Do you have a good joke to go to, Ganesh, to make us all laugh for a moment?
Yeah, say something funny.
Say something funny. There's nothing like pressure, is it? Yeah.
That's the thing that no comedian ever wants to hear. That's why I say it, right? Say something funny for us, will you?
Well, hopefully everything about me is funny. I've been told recently that people who listen to my TikToks or watch my TikToks don't even watch me, but they just put me to the side and listen to my accent because I'm so funny. My version of voice. So
I think your accent is quite posh.
Thanks. We're very connected to our English roots down here in New Zealand. So,
and Bill was just saying the other night that next to me, you have the best hair in post-Mormonism. Weren't you saying that, Bill?
I do. No, Rebecca
you were
said
saying
that. Rebecca said that, I think, but I do think that he does have great hair, better than mine for sure.
Look, I'm going through my Richard Gere phase of my life.
Gerbils beware.
That's right.
They don't. Do they have gerbils down there? And
no, they don't have gerbils in New Zealand.
well, that explains why.
Look at you passing on urban legends as rumored truth. RFL.
I didn't make any accusations. I was simply saying, giving a warning and asking a few questions.
Everyone should consult Snopes, which is a great site for ensuring that the rumors we pass on have any truth to them.
Snopes is actually Greek for gerbils.
Yeah. Gene, do you have a question? Sorry, I'm not trying to move on. I
have a burning question.
A burning question for Ganesh.
What type of criticism might someone like Brian Hales have for your work?
Oh, funny you should ask that, because he actually messaged me today and offered some criticism. So he believes that he bought my book, which is lovely, and he reached out and commented on it, and his criticism is still that the Book of Mormon is too literally advanced for Joseph, that all of the people around him could not ascribe it to him.
Where'd the words come from?
So he believes they come from God, of course, and I think it comes from his environment, and I've tried to show that for 45 different chapters on the subject. But yeah, we're going to have to disagree on that, I'm sure. And look, I really like Brian. He's I've spent a bit of time with him. I enjoy his company. I love what he's done for Mormon history. Obviously, we're on different ends of the spectrum on authenticity and authorship of the Book of Mormon. But yeah, he's good.
I was channeling Joseph earlier, and I came up. He said that if he had a podcast, it'd be called the Glass Liquor Podcast. So that's what I put below my name.
There you go. Well, thank you.
Well, the next time you talk to Brian, if you'd let him know that RFM says that he thinks that Joseph Smith got the words from the same place that Richard Gere got the gerbils.
It's from Snopes.
Well, I told him that
the room doctor got the gerbils.
I told him I would be on Mormonism Live if he wanted to ask a question out loud. So I doubt he's listening right now, but he probably will listen later. And I hope to spend a bit of time with him when I'm in Utah in the next month.
Well, thank you, Gene. Thanks for coming into the show and asking the question. Have a great day, my friend.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
If Brian ever wants to go on a show with you, we'd be happy to host a discussion here between the two of you. I know Brian would like that.
That'd be great. He is on a mission at the moment, so he's got the badge and everything.
But it's not a real mission, is it?
It's he can live at home and go to the church history library every day, which is gosh, that would be I would go on that mission. That sounds fabulous.
He gets conjugal visits too, right?
Well, his wife is with him on the mission, so
that's what I said.
There you go. Well, I do have a phone call. It sounds like maybe it's Caleb. Caleb, is that the name?
Yeah, that's correct.
Go ahead, my friend. What's your question for Ganesh?
Yeah, so I just kind of want to make a point. First of all, I want to say I've been listening, guys, for a little bit. I'm a Pentecostal pastor in the southwest part of Virginia, in Appalachia, and I'm ex-Mo. I mean, not ex-Mo, never Mo. I've never been a Mormon, but I've interacted with a lot. And so you guys have been really helpful in a lot of the things I've encountered. And before my question, I'll make a just wanted to make a quick funny thing. Being Pentecostal, it's really funny listening to your guys' dear friend Jacob Hansen when he claims that Mormons are the fastest, or might be the fastest growing religion. He always says that when Pentecostals we came in afterwards, and we have over 200 million members worldwide. So even my denomination has 85 million worldwide, and we were formed in 1914. So anyway, it's not even a question. But anyway,
Caleb, I got to ask you. Caleb.
Yes.
Caleb,
Yes.
do you handle snakes?
I do not, but I grew up really close to the West Virginia border, and I do know of a church that does. And
I thought maybe you would.
One of the deacons one of the deacons at my church actually grew up in that county in West Virginia and worked for emergency services and did an EMS call to a snake handling church one time. But we don't associate with those guys. Right. But my point is going to be on the salvation slide is really interesting because I've read the Book of Mormon a couple times, but the Messiah slide about the salvation, I wish I would have reread that because I talked to some missionaries about a year ago, and my whole point was going through the salvation in part in 3rd Nephi where you just have to be baptized and accept Jesus. I'm like, why can't I do this and make it to the celestial kingdom? And they really didn't have an answer other than that's not the way it says now. But that's what the Book of Mormon says. And it's a big conundrum that I think really hurts the church because the Book of Mormon plan of salvation is not the same as later on that what the LDS church holds today.
That's true.
So it was interesting, that slide showing that, and it just made me think of my talk with the missionaries. So.
And that speaks to a good point, is that people think of the Book of Mormon as being just a singular understanding, and generally it is, but there is a lot of development within the dictation sequence of the Book of Mormon, because Joseph is learning as he's going. He's developing quite quickly, and it's happening in real time. So it's fascinating to see him change his tact, or at least develop so quickly along the time frame, because we were only talking 3 months, and a lot is happening in that time.
Thank you, caller.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, did you want to say something else? There was just a long pause there, so I was just trying to. Give you a chance to move on.
I was just going to ask if you guys have any good on that of how the church has responded to that. Any resources for me on the differencing of salvation? Because you mentioned Mosiah has one way, 3rd Nephi. So in case they ever bring that up, is there any good things I can see of possible responses or resources?
Well, maybe the book.
I think that most Mormons are going
I could get that for sure, yes.
I think most Mormons will default to the idea that the LDS Church is based upon the Book of Mormon, and therefore the leaders of the LDS Church today are the only authorized interpreters of the Book of Mormon as well. They wouldn't use those expressions, but I think that's what it amounts to.
Yeah, true.
Okay. Yeah, and I was going to say real quick on that, it was interesting because it wasn't just the 2 missionaries. They had a older person with them, which that's the first time I had encountered that, and I met with like 20 missionaries, and he really didn't have a good response either. Anyway, just a final point. That's all I have. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, caller. Have a great day.
It's a difficult argument, and it does hone in on what you've been talking about, Ganesh, is that there is a 23-year-old Joseph Smith and his rather innocent, somewhat naive, unformed ideas about religion that he's going to start putting out there. And then it develops, and he thinks about it. I mean, this is all that he does, really is religion. Everything he does is religiously connected in one way or another, even if it's a bank. So he is smart. He's intelligent. He grows. He develops. He finds that the things that he started with don't answer all the questions that can arise because of it. And so he starts broadening out his ideas and making Mormonism from the Book of Mormon, which is basically heaven and hell, And if you're, if you do what you're supposed to do, then you go to heaven. If not, you go to hell, and death is the end. That's the cutoff point. That's the deadline. It's very explicit in the Book of Mormon in chapter 34 of Alma. Death is it. And once you get to death, that's game over. Okay. You have eternally you procrastinated the day of your repentance until it is too late. And so, but by the time Joseph Smith is done in 15 years, now that is expanded, and it is to the point where almost everybody gets saved in one way or another, except for the sons of perdition. So it goes from anti-universalist rhetoric in the Book of Mormon to almost complete universalist doctrine in Mormonism.
Yeah. And that pivot, actually happens quite early. It happens with the revelation to Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith on the 3 degrees, and I can't remember who was that postulated that might well have been the reason why Joseph was attacked to the Johnson John farm. That he'd gone. That some people saw that as going to universalism when actually that was seen as a heresy, right?
Right.
And so, yeah.
Right. Well, we've got no more callers. Ganesh, say anything else you want to say here, and then we'll wrap it up and let you go. Well, you are home, but we'll let you go about your day.
Fabulous. Well, I guess the only thing I kind of wanted to finish with, and it's kind of harkens to a question that Bill had put to me a couple of days ago, and that was the idea of, well, what do I want from this? What is this book supposed to do? Who did I write it for? And, what is it about? And I think for me, I'm hoping, I initially wrote it for myself to answer the question of, and a question that I think comes up on this channel a lot is, how did all 3 of us, but the thousands of others who watch, how as thinking, thoughtful, critical thinkers, why did we believe so deeply and gloss over so many red flags when they appeared? And what were the things that tipped us over the edge to go, hang on a second, I've got to look at this more critically and examine. And look, like Bill, I'm a bishop, and kind of feel an incredible amount of responsibility to be honest and forthright, but also to care about people. And I see an incredible amount, and I'm sure that both of you do too, of people who are harmed, that relationships that break down, marriages, families, where people find this information and come across a Joseph that doesn't sync with their values, and it takes them down a rabbit hole, often out of the church and into conflict with the people that they love the most. And sometimes that's disastrous for relationships. And so there's a lot of people in pain. And so I hope that the book will do 3 things. One is for people who are in pain because Mormonism kind of doesn't make sense, or hasn't made sense, or they found something that is really difficult, that they'll read this and see it in its chronology and get a huge amount of validation that they're not mad or crazy, but actually when you order it in these subjects and by the chronology, you can see the development, and it's understandable for one thing, but also maybe they can slightly forgive Joseph for that pain, because you can see that he is a 23-year-old in the Book of Mormon, and you can see that he's a 38-year-old in Nauvoo, and understand that development, maybe have some empathy for that. So hopefully it will be a bit of peace and healing for people who have come across really tough stuff. And then secondary, those who are in the church who want to understand why some people might have a problem with Joseph, that they can read this and go, oh gosh, Joseph did some pretty crazy, sometimes really hurtful things to other people. And the implications of the things that he put forward have some major impacts on what happens today. And so that at least they can understand their family or friends that have left and build a bridge so it's not quite so painful, and maybe at some level hold their church to account. I'm an active member of the church. I go to church. I don't believe, obviously, I don't believe in the truth claims, but I want the church to be good. It has so many good things, and it has tons of money that it could enact amazing things. Why don't we as members, hold our church to account and make that possible? And probably the third group is those who are not members of the church, but Mormonism is fascinating at the moment, and everybody wants to know how this actually works. That this would give a really good grounding for people to go, oh gosh, I can understand this. And this system of development and a birth of a religion is actually really common. You can see this in a lot of different spaces, a lot of different organizations and institutions, and it maybe even the kinds of events that are happening around the world and in the United States today. You can kind of start to break them down so that you can understand them and not be so fearful about them. So those are my hopes. Whether that actually achieves that, I yet to be seen, and I'm sure people will use it for whatever. But I hope that it provides some peace and healing from all sides, so that we can be whole.
Thank you, Ganesh. The book is Joseph Smith, The Architect of Mormonism, a topical biography by Ganesh Cherian, available at Amazon. I think it's a great book, and I think that you will think so too. Thank you again, Ganesh. By the way, Bill, this Friday, there's no Mormonism After Dark. Is that true on account of it's the 4th of July? Yes.
4th of July. Yes. 4th of July. No Mormonism After Dark. We figure all of you are going to want to be out spending time with family, friends, maybe seeing some fireworks go off, and didn't think it would be a great idea to have a show that night. So no Mormonism After Dark this week, but we'll be back next week to continue the show.
Yeah, please have a great Independence Day weekend. Be safe out there, and we'll see you again on Monday, the newscast, 6:00 p.m., and once again on next Wednesday, another episode of Mormonism Live. Thanks again, Ganesh. Thanks, everybody, and thank you, Bill. We'll see you next week. Good night, everyone.
Thanks.